The New Mexico sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty road leading to the Apache reservation, where a rusted pickup truck struggled up the hillside, its engine coughing like an old man with pneumonia. Behind the wheel sat Thomas Bennett, a rancher whose weathered face told stories of 30 years fighting the harsh desert land, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel with the kind of tension that comes from facing the unknown. Thomas had received the summons 3 days ago, a formal letter on tribal council letterhead requesting his presence at a hearing, and the weight of that paper had kept him awake every night since. The letter didn't specify the charges, didn't explain the complaint, only stated that he was to appear before the council to address a matter involving tribal members. And Thomas had spent those sleepless nights replaying every interaction he'd had with his Apache neighbors. His ranch bordered the reservation, a fact that had defined his entire adult life. Sometimes for better, often for worse, in ways that left permanent marks on his conscience. As he pulled into the gravel parking area outside the tribal council building, Thomas noticed 2 women standing near the entrance, and his stomach dropped like a stone into cold water. They were the Yazzie sisters, Clara and Alina, both over 6 feet tall, with the kind of presence that made grown men step aside, their dark eyes watching his approach with expressions he couldn't quite read. Thomas had known them for 15 years, ever since they'd moved back to the reservation after their father's death, and in all that time, their relationship had been cordial but distant, marked by the invisible boundary that separated their worlds. Clara, the older sister at 42, worked as a social worker for the tribe, her reputation for fierce advocacy making her both respected and feared in equal measure. Alina, 3 years younger, taught mathematics at the reservation high school, her sharp intellect and sharper tongue legendary among students who tried to take shortcuts. Both women had been raised by their grandmother after their mother left and their father drank himself to death. A story Thomas knew only through whispers and secondhand accounts that painted a picture of resilience forged in hardship. Thomas stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching on the gravel, and walked toward the building, nodding respectfully to the sisters as he passed. "Mr. Bennett," Clara said, her voice steady and formal, stopping him in his tracks with just those 2 words. "We'll be speaking at the hearing today. Wanted you to know that beforehand, so you're not surprised when we stand up." Thomas felt his throat go dry, his mind racing through possibilities like a horse spooked by thunder, trying to understand what complaint they could possibly have against him. "I don't understand," he managed to say, his voice rough with anxiety and confusion. "If I've done something to offend or hurt you ladies, I apologize. I never intended any harm." Elena's expression softened slightly, just a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, before she shook her head slowly. "The council will explain everything, Mr. Bennett. Best we all hear it together in the proper setting." Inside the council chamber, 7 tribal elders sat in a semicircle, their ages ranging from 50 to well past 80. Each face a map of wisdom earned through decades of navigating 2 worlds. Council Chairman Robert Silver Cloud, a man of 70 with silver braids hanging past his shoulders, gestured for Thomas to take the seat facing the council, his weathered hand moving with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Thomas Bennett," Chairman Silvercloud began. You've been called here today regarding events that occurred on your property over the past 15 years, events that have come to our attention through testimony provided by Clara and Alina Yazzie. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind scrolling through 15 years of memories, searching desperately for the transgression that had brought him here. Had he accidentally let his cattle drift onto reservation land? Had he diverted water that belonged to the tribe? Had he said something offensive without realizing the impact of his words? Clara stood up, her tall frame commanding attention, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the council in a mixture of English and Apache, then switched fully to English for Thomas's benefit. 15 years ago, my sister and I returned to the reservation after our grandmother became ill. We had nothing but the clothes we wore and the shame of our family's history weighing on our shoulders. Our father's drinking had destroyed our family's reputation. The house we inherited was falling apart. We had no money to fix it, no resources to rebuild what had been lost to years of neglect and pain. Alina stood beside her sister, adding her voice to the testimony, her words measured and precise like the mathematical proofs she taught her students. We were trying to repair the roof before winter, working with materials we'd salvaged and borrowed. When Thomas Bennett drove up to our property in his truck, he didn't know us, had no reason to help us. Probably had heard the stories about our father and had every reason to keep driving. Thomas remembered that day now. The memory flooding back with sudden clarity. Two tall women on a dangerous roof with inadequate equipment, trying to patch holes before the autumn rains came. He'd stopped because it looked unsafe, had offered to help before even introducing himself properly, and spent the next 2 weekends helping them secure the roof and repair the worst of the structural damage. Clara continued, her voice growing stronger with emotion. That winter, when the pipes froze and burst, Thomas showed up with supplies and tools. He spent an entire day in freezing temperatures helping us fix the plumbing. When Elena's car broke down and she couldn't get to work, Thomas lent her his old farm truck for 2 months while she saved enough money for repairs, never asking for payment or compensation. When I needed to transport furniture for families I was helping through social services, Thomas offered his truck and his time, driving hours out of his way to help people he'd never met. Elena's voice joined her sister's, creating a harmony of testimony that filled the chamber when the high school couldn't afford new textbooks. Thomas donated money anonymously, but we figured out it was him because he asked specific questions about what subjects needed the most help. When families on the reservation struggled during the pandemic, losing jobs and facing eviction, Thomas hired workers he didn't really need for his ranch, paying fair wages even though he was barely breaking even himself. Thomas sat frozen, his face burning with embarrassment. His hands clasped tightly in his lap as 15 years of small kindnesses were laid bare before the council and assembled community members who had gathered to witness the hearing. Chairman Silvercloud raised his hand, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the chamber. His eyes fixed on Thomas with an expression that mixed curiosity and something deeper. Thomas Bennett, is this testimony accurate? Have you provided this assistance to the Yazzie sisters and other tribal members over the past 15 years? Thomas cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. I just did what any neighbor would do.
What anyone should do
when they see people who need help. It wasn't anything special. My ranch borders your land. These women are my neighbors. Those families who struggled are my neighbors. I couldn't just look away when people needed help. Clara stepped forward, her dark eyes glistening with unshed tears, her voice thick with emotion. That's exactly the point, Mr. Bennett. You could have looked away. Most people did. Our father's reputation, our family's history. It gave people excuses to avoid us, to pretend they didn't see when we struggled, to justify their indifference with our past. But you never asked about our father. Never treated us like we carried his shame. Never made us feel like we owed you anything beyond basic human dignity, Alina added, her mathematical precision giving way to raw feeling. You saw us as people, not as the daughters of the reservation drunk, not as charity cases, not as the Apache women living on the border of your property. You helped us the same way you'd help anyone, with respect and kindness, without making us feel small or grateful or less than. Chairman Silvercloud stood up, his silver braids catching the light from the windows, his voice taking on the formal tone of official tribal business. Thomas Bennett, this council has heard testimony regarding your actions over the past 15 years. Actions that demonstrate the values of community, respect, and human dignity that form the foundation of our people's traditions. Clara and Alina Yazzie have brought you before this council not to accuse you, but to honor you. To recognize publicly what you have done privately, the chairman pulled out a folded document, his weathered hands holding it with reverence. The tribal council has voted unanimously to grant you honorary membership in the White Mountain Apache tribe, recognition rarely given to those not born into our nation. This membership comes with certain rights, including access to tribal health care, invitation to all cultural ceremonies and gatherings, and the respect and protection of our entire community. More importantly, it comes with responsibilities, the responsibility to continue treating all people with the dignity and kindness you have shown. To be a bridge between communities, to demonstrate that humanity transcends boundaries of land and blood. Thomas felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, his throat too tight to speak, his hands trembling as the chairman approached and placed the document in his calloused palms. Clara and Alina walked over, standing on either side of him, their tall frames bracketing his smaller stature, their hands resting gently on his shoulders. "You gave us more than help with a roof or a borrowed truck," Clara said softly. Her voice meant only for his ears. "You gave us dignity when the world had taken it away. You saw us as worthy when others saw us as broken." Alina nodded, her sharp features softened by genuine affection. "You taught our students through your example that character isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up when it's difficult, helping when it's inconvenient, treating everyone like they matter." The council chamber erupted in applause. Tribal members standing to honor the man who had lived the values they held sacred, who had crossed invisible boundaries with simple human kindness. Thomas stood there, overwhelmed by the recognition, by the understanding that his small acts of neighborliness had meant so much more than he'd ever imagined. Chairman Silvercloud raised his hand for silence once more, his voice ringing with authority and warmth. "Let this day be remembered. Let Thomas Bennett's name be recorded in our tribal history as a friend and brother. Let his example teach our children that true kinship is built not through blood alone, but through actions that honor the humanity in every person." As the ceremony concluded, Thomas found himself surrounded by tribal members, shaking hands and receiving embraces from people he'd helped and many he'd never met. An elderly woman approached, her face deeply lined with age, her eyes bright with intelligence. "I'm Sarah Yazzie, grandmother to Clara and Alina. I passed 10 years ago. But I saw what you did for my granddaughters before I left this world. I died knowing they had a true friend watching over them, that they weren't alone, and that peace carried me into the next life." Thomas realized she meant she was the girl's great-aunt, not their deceased grandmother, and he clasped her hands with gratitude, unable to articulate the emotion churning in his chest. Clara and Alina walked him out to his truck as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. "Thank you," Thomas finally managed to say, his voice still rough with emotion. "I never expected anything like this. I was terrified I'd done something wrong." Clara laughed, a sound of genuine joy. "We know. That's why Alina wanted to explain before the hearing. But I insisted on the surprise, wanted you to feel the full impact of what your kindness has meant." Alina smiled, a rare expression that transformed her serious face. "Our students ask us all the time who the best person we know is. From today forward, we'll have an official answer backed by tribal council recognition." Thomas drove home that evening with the honorary membership document on his passenger seat, his mind replaying the ceremony, the testimonies, the moment when 15 years of small kindnesses were recognized as something profound. He thought about his own father, who taught him that neighbors help neighbors regardless of the boundaries between them, who believed that human dignity was the most precious thing anyone could give or receive. He thought about the Yazzie sisters, how they'd transformed their family's legacy through education, service, and the courage to ask for help when they needed it, never letting pride prevent them from accepting kindness. He thought about the invisible walls that separate communities, the prejudices and histories that make people see borders instead of bridges, divisions instead of connections. As he pulled into his ranch, the familiar sight of his modest home and struggling cattle operation, Thomas realized that wealth wasn't measured in acres or livestock or bank accounts. True wealth was measured in the relationships built through consistent kindness, in the trust earned through reliable presence, in the community created when people chose to see each other's humanity. The next morning, Thomas found a handmade blanket on his porch, woven in traditional Apache patterns, with a note from Clara and Alina thanking him for being the brother they'd never had. He wrapped it around his shoulders as he drank his morning coffee, watching the sun rise over the land that connected his property to the reservation, no longer seeing a boundary, but a bridge. Thomas Bennett had spent 15 years being a good neighbor without expecting recognition, and in return, he'd received something far more valuable than honors or titles. He'd received family, community, and the knowledge that small acts of consistent kindness can change lives in ways we never imagine. creating ripples that spread far beyond our limited vision. The two giant Apache sisters who'd seemed so intimidating had given him the greatest gift possible. They'd shown him that his life had mattered, that his choices had made a difference, that kindness is never wasted even when it goes unnoticed. And in a world that often feels divided by boundaries we can't cross and differences we can't reconcile, that recognition was everything. A reminder that our common humanity is stronger than anything that separates us. Retry.